Okay, so we're back with another video. I was looking through some of the stuff that I talked about, over the years, and it occurred to me that I'd never done a video talking about the Four Musketeers. And I couldn't believe it. I couldn't believe it because this really is one of those films that I have such high regard for. There's certain films that come along and they really click and you really feel, okay, this is something special. You might have films like obviously the Lord of the Rings trilogy, most certainly. The Exorcist and Sorcerer, that phenomenal 1-2 punch from William Friedkin. Something like Jet Li's Hero. And you just think, yeah, like these are really in that upper echelon, legitimately great. Of course, you have different categories. You have some genuinely good films, very good films, and even you have like your run of the mill. They do what they need to do, entertaining. But yeah, then you have that upper echelon where like yeah, we're into, that whole idea of film as an art form. These are examples of art. These really do advance the notion of film as an art form. So yeah, Four Musketeers. I do specify that it's significant because, of course, this is part of a 1-2 punch from Richard Lester. In '73, of course, we got the Three Musketeers, and then following year we got this, all shot as one film essentially. But then, of course, they realised, well, we've got so much material here. Let's take it into two movies. Why not? We don't, and thank goodness they did because both films have a very different personality. Really, The Three Musketeers, it's a fine film. I do like the film very much, but it is very light, certainly comparatively speaking, much lighter than The Four Musketeers. And it does have a natural conclusion, of course, because, of course, it's D'Artagnan's journey to become the fourth musketeer in our title. We have our original three, Athos, Aramis, and Porthos, and then, obviously, by the end of the film, D'Artagnan becomes a musketeer, and then it provides, like, a natural jumping off point, and then, of course, you start this film, but this also works. I mean, as a standard, you can watch one without the other. Essentially, I mean, the Three Musketeers works as a complete film, and this film, of course, the Four Musketeers, it has a great recap with Frank Finlay providing the opening narration. It tells you everything you need to know. It sets the board fine, but this film obviously much darker. And it's interesting what Richard Lester does because obviously Richard Lester's sensibilities sometimes are. I don't know. He's a bit all over the place, is Richard Lester. You never know quite how to take him. Obviously, yeah, the Three Musketeers is very, very fun. But then, of course, what happens in the Four Musketeers? The war's underway. And obviously we're up in the ante, because if you think of it in the grand scheme of the overall story, this is where we build up to the grand finale, and obviously the nature of I suppose it's the nature of the material really more so than Richard Lester. Like if Richard Lester was just free to his own devices, that would be different. But obviously he's kept restrained, I suppose. I don't know what it is about this film. It's just got such a unique because there is comedy and levity in there, but then it's like a switch gets flicked. There's obviously there's great set pieces in here, and obviously the finale of the film that takes place at the monastery we have the grand battle with the Musketeers against the Cardinal's guards, and then of course it culminates with D'Artagnan going up against Rochefort. Um, Wonderful, wonderful stuff. Obviously, one of the things that always stands out as well about these films, both films, is the choreography, the swordplay, because it's not refined, deliberately so. It's very, very scrappy, and again, that's by design, and it's something that obviously Christopher Lee was particularly proud of these two films. Not so much we won't talk about the Return of the Musketeers, even though I don't dislike that film, but that's another matter entirely. But yeah, these first two films, obviously Christopher Lee was quite proud. And it gave him something different to do, because obviously he was in an interesting point in his career at that point. He'd kind of broken away from Dracula as well as Hammer. Obviously, we had a wonderful jumping off point for him with Man with a Golden Gun. Then we got this, and of course you might point to something as well like Hanny Calder, getting into doing a western. Who'd have ever thought Christopher Lee in a western? But obviously he gets to play a wonderful character here with Rochefort. But obviously he gets some fantastic sword fights to be part of. But he was, you listen to some of the interviews he's done over the years, because he's done so many fight scenes in his career, sword fights. But yeah, he was saying the choreography in these films is deliberately different. It's not elegant, it's not graceful. These are people fighting to kill each other, and obviously they're fighting with heavy swords and they get tired. And the fight that Christopher Lee and Michael York have at the end of this film, I think is one of the all-time great fight scenes. And what is great is the fact that you can see the progression of the fight. You can see these guys, they're getting tired, man. But it's a wonderful, wonderful film. As you say, even as a standalone. And this is how I choose to watch it more often than not. I mean, in terms of the Blu-rays, I did specifically pick up this one on its own. I did... Well, my dad very kindly, as a present when they were released on the Studio Canal DVDs years ago, they did the double pack, 3 and 4 Musketeers as a two for one, 2 for 1. So I got that, but then obviously wanted to make the upgrade to Blu-ray. But I was umming and ahhing, and I just wanted this one. This, I think, is the definitive Musketeer film. Obviously, there's been so many adaptations over the years. But everyone in this is so wonderful. And again, what a cast. I mean, the Four Musketeers alone, with Michael York, Oliver Reed, Richard Chamberlain, Frank Finlay, so you've got 4 wonderful names. And again, I should take the opportunity to say as well, with the recent passing of Richard Chamberlain, it's a good opportunity to, remember him through this film. The Musketeer films were, in fact, my introduction to Richard Chamberlain. But I love him as Aramis. But everyone in this is perfectly cast, really. But obviously, our core 4 players, got some great names there. But then, as you say, you throw the likes of Christopher Lee and Charlton Heston in there, and then Raquel Welch and Faye Dunaway. And then we have other, wonderful people sprinkled in there. Obviously, Roy Kinnear, Simon Ward, Joss Ackland. There's some real. It's a fantastic ensemble, basically, that they put together for this. But if we were to get into specific stuff, obviously we've talked about the great set pieces and the great final fight. Lalo Schifrin's music score is one of the MVPs of this, and we talk about a darker tone, because obviously the first film has a very whimsical feel, and again, much of that is brought on through the score, which was composed by Michel Legrand. Michel Legrand did the music for the first film, and it works. But then, of course, this film being a totally different entity, obviously bringing in Lalo Schifrin, and he brings a whole different personality and a whole different vibe to the proceedings, and his score is great. And the theme, I don't know whether you want to call it a love theme, but the theme that recurs throughout, or do you want to call it cue, motif, whatever you want to call it, obviously we hear it when Athos gets into the backstory with him and Milady de Winter, or the Comte de la Fere and Milady de Winter, and then they bring it back multiple times throughout the film. It's a wonderful piece of music, but it just adds so much. And again, branching on from that, I think the best scene of this film is at the inn when Athos confronts Milady de Winter just after she's been given the letter from the cardinal, by my hand and for the good of the state, the bearer has done what has been done. That whole scene between Oliver Reed and Faye Dunaway that's the best scene, I think, in the film. And it's the whole atmosphere of it, the way it's staged, the way it's performed. Oliver Reed, because obviously, you talk about the actor who owns the space, obviously because he's got the lion's share of the dialogue. A lot of it's basically him carrying it and just basically Faye Dunaway reacting. And obviously she, both equally important. But Oliver Reed's always just been such a fascinating performer. He's got such a wonderful screen presence. And playing this character, obviously, he's great in the first film, but this really, I think, The Four Musketeers is Oliver Reed's film because he's given some really interesting stuff to do in this, because we really get more of Athos' backstory in this. But that scene, again, the way that Oliver Reed carries it and the way that Faye Dunaway follows him through it, and again the accompaniment of Lalo Schifrin's score, it's a wonderfully performed scene. Again, I say this and I mean it as a tremendous compliment. There are parts where it comes off very theatrical, and I love that. You could see this scene played out on a stage. It could be fantastic. But it's really, really wonderful stuff. And again, so Oliver Reed, I really do believe this is his film. Even though, it's D'Artagnan's story, absolutely. And Michael York is great. Michael York's always great. But, yeah, there's something about Oliver Reed's performance in this. And especially, like you say, when you pinpoint certain moments that just elevate, really. But yeah, again, I couldn't believe I hadn't talked about this one before. Obviously, it's a film that's been in my life for a long time. And again, of all of the different again, it's one of those, The Musketeers, like Dracula, whenever you hear, there's going to be another adaptation of this, your eyes, you can't help but your eyes roll back into the back of your head. It's just you've got this involuntary reflex to it. But I really do believe that this is the definitive adaptation. As it happens, I am currently reading The Three Musketeers. After all this time, I finally decided I'll take the plunge. Much like Dracula, finally took the plunge on Dracula on the lead up to Nosferatu. So glad I did. And I'm really, off the back of that, really enjoying reading The Musketeers. But even then, you can see the spirit, the capture, even across both films. Granted, I am only halfway through the book, so I can only really speak more towards the first film. But the first film largely captures the spirit of the book, and I imagine, it'll continue in much the same way. Obviously, there's always going to be differences or departures, but that's, But for the most part, and again, even in terms of, you can see, you read the character on the page and you can see the actors. You can see Oliver Reed. You can see Michael York. And obviously Richard Chamberlain and Frank Finlay. And it's great. It's really great. They've done a wonderful casting here. But that again, just bringing this to a close, I just wanted to talk about this film again, because it's one of those as well. I suppose it kind of gets lost in the mix. I mean, I suppose if you were around when the films came out, because it was it was a pretty big thing. I mean, a big event. You've got this wonderful lavish production with an all-star cast, so it's going to be something to see. But obviously, there's been subsequent versions since then, so it stands to reason that there's a lot of people who might not have even seen these, of course. But yeah, if I could put you onto them, and even if you want to just watch the Four Musketeers functions as a standalone film. But again, this film, it means a lot to me. It brings me so much joy, and any opportunity to talk about it. And again, I just think that wonderful scene between Oliver Reed and Faye Dunaway, and then of course the great finale at the end. And we get into some bleak stuff as well, because obviously it ultimately ends with Milady de Winter being apprehended, by Athos, and we get the execution. And again, it gets into some dark stuff. It gets bleak. And again, I think one of the 70s, 1970s films, they did bleak well. They really could bring a certain, again, atmosphere, certain weight. And again, we get some of that here, because obviously, you've got obviously it's interesting, the scene where they have her executed, man, because you've got Athos, who's just stoic. He's immovable as a mountain. And he's just, obviously he's finally going to see justice done. The woman he thought had died years before, he's finally going to make sure she goes the way she should have gone. And then obviously you've got the interesting little brief moment of conflict between him and D'Artagnan, because obviously D'Artagnan's conflicted. But yeah, there's some really, really great stuff going on in this film. And I really think that's why it elevates it over and above the first film. We get into some really, really interesting stuff here. But yeah, again, that pretty much wraps this up. I've gone on for long enough. And I'd love to hear your thoughts if you're fans of the film. If you haven't seen it, again, I'd love to hear your thoughts if you do decide to check it out. But thank you for indulging me. It's always so much fun to talk about. Again, I always want to focus on the positives. Let's not waste time on the things that disappoint us, and let's focus on the things that bring us joy. And this film most certainly does. So that's the Four Musketeers, and I hope you've enjoyed me talking about it. And I'd love to hear your thoughts. Thank you for sticking with me, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one. Thank you, everybody. Bye bye.